All right, thanks, Scott. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It is April 22nd, 2021, and it is 7:32. This is the meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority. And before we start the meeting, before calling the meeting to order, I want to make sure that we remind everybody we're doing everything virtually. We're doing this because of the governor's safer at home order. It ensures the safety of all residents, staff, and HRA members that are participating. And we're all doing this from home or offices. And before we begin, there's a few things to cover. There's no public hearing today in the HRA meeting. We've only got community comment, and you'll be allowed to speak in community comment if you call in about anything that's not on the agenda today or scheduled for a future public hearing before the HRA. And if you want to call in, you should get ready. It is the number is 800-374-0221. 800-374-0221, and the conference ID is 3279979. 3279979, and then you'll be put in the queue eventually, and then Director Benarott will bring you into the HRA. So with having said that, let's call the meeting to order, and Liz Olson's with us this morning, and she'll do roll call. Roll call, please, Ms. Olson.
Thank you. Commissioner Staunton? Commissioner Staunton?
Uh-oh.
You're
See his name on the screen.
Aye. Here.
Commissioner Pierce?
Here.
Commissioner Jackson?
Here.
Commissioner Anderson?
Here.
Chair Hupland?
Here. Next matter on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. I will rise for the pledge. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We've got a form of meeting agenda in front of us this morning. Is there anyone who wishes to modify the agenda? Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda as shown?
So moved.
Commissioner Jackson moves. Commissioner Anderson seconds.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Roll call, please. Ms. Olson, with respect to approving the meeting agenda.
Commissioner Staunton?
Here. Aye.
Commissioner Pierce?
Oh, here. Oh, here.
I'm having a slow start this morning. Sorry.
Aye.
Commissioner
I
Jackson?
haven't finished the first cup of coffee yet.
We thought you were out searching for it.
Commissioner Anderson?
Aye.
Chair Hupland?
Aye. The meeting agenda is approved. Next, we have community comment. As I mentioned earlier, the call-in number for community comment, if you want to talk to the HRA about something that's not on the agenda today or scheduled for a future public hearing, call 800-374-0221. 800-374-0221. Conference ID is 3279979. Press star 1 to speak. The operator will put you in the queue, and then you'll be muted until it's your turn. You'll be given 3 minutes to speak. Liz Olson will be our timer, and she'll let you know when you've run up against the 3-minute mark and you need to wrap up your comments. So, Ms. Olson or Director Benarott, do we have anybody in the queue?
Good morning, Chair Hovland, members of the commission. Unless my son walks through the laundry room to get his shirt, I'm feeling very lonely again today. I have no one on the line, and my house is pretty quiet right now. Because there is a slight delay in the broadcast, I would recommend we wait about a minute before moving on in case we do have anyone who's trying to get in. My clock shows that it's 7:36, so I will come back to you at 7:37 or when I have a caller, whichever comes first.
All right, very good. Thank you. I've only got a partial agenda here. I got to search electronically for it here, so I might have to have Did that come from Jennifer Garsky?
Would have come from Liz Olson.
Ms. Olson?
Thank you, Chair. I will resend that to you now.
I have no callers, so I think it's safe for you to move forward.
Okay, thank you. Bear with me a moment. No, I'm still waiting for it. What's next on the agenda? I had printed a hard copy of it last night, and I have 2 pages here, but I'm missing page 2. I have page 2.
Adoption of the consent agenda.
All right, thank you.
It was just resent. My apologies.
It might not be you. It might have been my home printer. As I recall, there were several items on the consent agenda.
Yes,
Here, it
Your
may have
Honor.
just arrived. Hold on. Yeah, just got it. Thank you, Manager Neal and Ms. Olson. Okay.
See, Ron, it's getting around to everything.
Now, we've got on the consent agenda, we've got 3 items on the consent agenda. Is there a motion to adopt the consent agenda as shown? First of all, let me ask if anyone wants to remove an item from the consent agenda. Manager Neal?
Mr. Chair, I don't want to remove any item from the consent agenda, but I do want to point out that we had some discussion about maybe possible second thoughts on this pedestrian bridge project. And I do want to note that that's sort of the key of that's what's in this consent agenda for today. There's a $200,000 design services contract and a $20-some thousand estimating services contract for this bridge. So staff still recommends that we go forward with it, but I just want to make sure that the HRA is aware of that before you adopt the consent agenda today.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. I think the conversation the other night was helpful in that regard. Comment, Commissioner Jackson?
Thank you. Yes, I had a conversation yesterday with Mr. Neuendorf, and my objections that I raised the other night have been cleared up, so I'm good to go with this.
All right, good. Thank you. Anyone else have any reservations? I think with uniform thought that this pedestrian connection is important, just where it should be. All right, let's, if there's hearing no one that wants to remove an item from the consent agenda, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda as shown?
So moved.
Commissioner Staunton moves.
Second.
Commissioner Pierce seconds. You guys are extraordinarily polite this morning to each other. And any further discussion? Roll call, please, Ms. Olson, with respect to adoption of the consent agenda.
Commissioner Staunton,
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
Commissioner Anderson,
Aye.
Chair Hovland.
Aye. Consent agenda items are adopted. And then we are on to the reports and recommendations portion of the agenda, and we're going to have a conversation this morning with Nick Anhut from Ellers, our public finance advisors, about the affordable housing financing tools that are available. I don't know if either Ms. Hawkinson, our affordable housing director, or Manager Neal have any preparatory remarks, but otherwise I'll turn it over to Mr. Anhut.
I understand, Mr. Chair, this is a resumption of Mr. Anhut's previous presentation that he was making to the HRA. And we've also reserved some time at the end of when Mr. Anhut is completed for a resumption of the council's discussion on 5146 Eden Avenue. So we hope to get some time with you to talk about that today. But that's all I got to tee up Mr. Anhut.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board, Manager Neal, Nick Anhut with Ellers and Associates. And yes, this is a continuation of our discussion about a month ago already to provide a broad overview of funding options for various types of affordable housing needs throughout the community. As I know that not everyone was able to participate, I am going to recap a few of the initial slides, but then plan to pick up where we left off last time. So the topics discussed a variety of local roles and financing mechanisms available to the HRA in Edina. We discussed tax increment financing and tax abatement in the last discussion and provided some high-level overview of examples. First and foremost, we operate within a private marketplace, a capitalistic society, and private financing is quite limited, very competitive markets. When a project moves forward and needs to obtain the funding necessary to construct or reconstruct the project, they need to obtain financing from banks, various local investors, and often that underwriting is quite constrained. And when we introduce things like affordability into a project where we restrict the income that that project can generate, we create what's called a gap. In a typical circumstance, a mortgage and equity investment is able to build the project without any type of gap. They might have some limited public funding for a variety of site costs or local participation that the public wants to obtain within the project. But when we talk about affordable housing in particular, we typically will constrain that income that lowers the potential mortgage that the property could obtain. And it also creates less attractive returns on the equity that's necessary to invest in that project. That gap that is created between those needs an additional funding source, whether that's money that's provided up front or in the form of tax increment, could be an additional revenue stream that's created that can be used to obtain that higher mortgage or other lending. Just for purposes of the discussion, and because I like numbers, we decided to put some here on the screen just to illustrate the point that when you do constrain rental income by introducing affordability within a project, even though the project might be identical and might have the same exact costs, you're not able to obtain the same level of private financing through a bank and perhaps a first mortgage position. And even in some cases, also, you might not be able to obtain the level of equity that's necessary. That results in a gap at the end of the day that needs to be filled. So I'm going to skip over the majority of the TIF discussion that we had. I'll be happy to address questions at the end of this presentation, but I'm picking up where we left off last month. We did discuss kind of the mechanics of how tax increment and abatement, these tools that are based on property taxes, developed from a new development or a redevelopment at a substantial increase in value of a certain site. Those create revenue streams that the HRA can then allocate towards either assisting the developer in obtaining their financing to build the project, or to provide a mechanism to repay the HRA for its investment in the project. Two fundamental ways that these tools can be used. One is as a pay-as-you-go note, so that revenue stream is created and you're able to assign that to the developer to help them obtain the mortgage or subordinate loan necessary to fill the gap. So as those revenues come in over time, you assign a percentage of them to the developer and their financing so that they can build and maintain the project. This limits the risk to the public entity because it puts everything on the back of the developer to actually construct the project, obtain the financing to do so, and then also to maintain it at the tax levels necessary to generate the revenues. On the flip side, public entities also can consider their own, contributing their own financing towards the project and rely on that TIF or abatement revenue stream to repay themselves. So can often do this in the form of an interfund loan where you have an available source of funds up front that you can put into a project and then repay yourself with the increment over time. Can also use debt as another mechanism and issue bonds that can be secured by those tax increment or abatement revenues. Those bonds could be a general obligation where you would be applying the HRA or the city's credit to help assist the program to lower their overall cost of financing as well as interest costs and repay that. I highlight this because, you know, in the terms of the pedestrian bridge that we're talking about, that is perhaps one of the tools that we will be able to utilize within that Grandview area. Although it's not a direct assistance to a developer, it's going to help shape the redevelopment of that site. And that public infrastructure qualifies and can be financed with a bond repaid from increment in the future. Another aspect of tax increment that we should mention is as those revenues come in over time, not all of them might be pledged to the specific project, and you can accumulate balances within those funds. Those balances can be utilized to assist other projects, not just the one that generated the revenue in the first place. For housing in particular, there is no limitation on this pooling that can be done as long as the end state project that you're assisting qualifies under the statute. You can use TIF revenue collected from one housing district and apply it to other types of housing. It doesn't even have to be in a TIF district. As long as that housing qualifies, the HRA can use it to provide assistance to develop those affordable projects. You can also utilize pooling from other types of tax increment financing districts. However, they do have a bit more stringent limitations on them, and there are some percentages that cap the amount of pooling that you can utilize. And I think most of the board is most aware of this within the Southdale 2 TIF district and some of the caps that the legislation has imposed on your ability to pool those funds. But in the very same light as the prior topic, you can use this tool to either provide upfront financing for a project or essentially a promise to use future collections and assign those to a developer's financing or your own financing for that project. The one caveat with the pooling is both the projects and expenditures need to qualify under the terms of the original tax increment financing district. So often when we bring a new district forward, we will identify that within the budget. We will, especially when we're talking about housing, identify that those funds may be utilized in the future to assist other types of affordable housing projects. Another tool that I'm sure you're all aware of is the ability to impose a HRA levy on the local jurisdiction. These are flexible revenue sources, sort of the general fund of the HRA. They can be utilized to fund staff, capital investment, to fund studies within the area and general operations of the HRA and its housing and redevelopment objectives. That tool can also be used to, as a security to pledge the backing for debt that's issued either by the HRA or to supplement debt that's issued by the city of Edina. These revenue streams could be a backstop that could credit enhance certain forms of financing or be used directly to pay that debt service. They are often also used in Minnesota as a seed money to source revolving loan funds. There is a cap on the amount of the HRA's levy. It's based on the city's market value, so it does fluctuate on an annual basis as the overall market value of the community grows. That currently is about $2.5 million of potential capacity that could be utilized. However, that does mean that would require a tax increase on the local community, and so would have an impact on all the local property taxes within the city if you did want to increase your levy amount. And it is spread over the entire tax base. Another tool is the ability to use revolving loan funds to help fill the gap or provide bridge financing for redevelopment or other housing needs within the community. This does give you an opportunity to use them a little bit more widely within the community. It doesn't carry the same level of affordability restrictions that TIF or some of these other tools have, but it does allow you to step in and provide some public assistance to perhaps subsidize the interest that a homeowner or a multifamily developer would have to pay if they were to obtain 100% private financing for their projects, and can often help provide the impetus to move these projects that you find essential forward. These funds do require a source of initial capital, so that seed money that could come from an HRA levy. There is the ability to use pooling from existing tax increment financing districts, again, with many of those restrictions that I alluded to in the earlier slide. And also the ability to utilize other types of programs, namely through Hennepin County, even federal funds that are allocated to the city can provide that seed money. And of course, you would have to abide by the restrictions imposed by those entities if you're relying on external funds. Ultimately, it's the HRA policy that sets the parameters for how these loan funds can be utilized, putting perhaps a cap on the size of the loan, some thoughts on other parameters such as the duration, terms of repayment, an application process for these, as well as review. And I know Stephanie introduced a home rehabilitation program at just one of your prior meetings, and so you should be familiar with these types of programs. Another tool Edina does use is the establishment of a local housing trust fund, essentially a way to dedicate certain revenues to help fund in trust housing uses throughout the communities. Many communities are actually moving forward with establishing these funds, and you have done so for many years. This funding allows you to do many of the things that I mentioned. For the revolving loan funds, you can use those existing revenues to implement grant programs, loans, provide backstop financing or guarantees behind certain projects that qualify under your parameters. It can be used as a matching fund to try to spur more private investment within your community. They can also be utilized not just on the capital side, but to actually provide some operating or rental assistance for certain programs, very similar to voucher programs or the ability to step in and subsidize rents or other ongoing expenditures of affordable housing projects. They can also just be utilized to fund counseling services, marketing, and other types of efforts to try to bring more awareness to this topic, or certain areas of the community where you want to target your affordable housing needs. One of the interesting caveats of a housing trust fund is the ability to use these within the statute to partner with private entities, particularly with a nonprofit, or participate as a member of a joint powers entity to kind of pool resources from multiple public or nonprofit participants. And that will allow you perhaps to leverage some additional capacity within those partners, some additional perspective, as well as some of the expertise that they might be able to bring to the table in administering affordable housing program. Each trust is specific as to what its policy objectives are, the targets for affordability, housing types, and overall programming. Another tool available to cities that HRAs can play a role in is the establishment of housing improvement areas. This is a way to provide financing for improvements that are needed to maintain and preserve existing housing units. These are often used in situations where you have a common interest or a co-op or a housing association, and they're not able to otherwise obtain private financing for some of the common area improvements that those communities benefit from or find essential. And typically, these can be used for things like roofing within condominiums, some siding, roadway or trail repairs that they otherwise are not able to obtain private financing. A individual mortgage is not going to be able to be underwritten for a rooftop that you share with your neighbors, and the ability to sort of pool all of the interests of that common area into one entity can be quite challenging. And so this legislature introduced this tool a number of years ago, and it is still available for cities. Eligible improvements are defined by local policy. There is an enabling ordinance that is established at the city level that governs the use of housing improvement area financing. And the mechanism that is put in place is very similar to a special assessment. The repayment of the financing is done through a new fee that is imposed as part of the property tax payments from all of the property within that designated area. It can be imposed based on the tax capacity or the value of each one of those housing units, or the ordinance could establish that that fee is to be imposed based on square footage or a fair alternative. Again, the city is the one that imposes the ordinance, but it can identify the HRA to serve as its implementing entity, and it may also even appoint an advisory board to oversee one or multiple housing improvement areas throughout the community. When a housing improvement area comes forward, it does require that the owners submit a petition to establish a public hearing to consider the new area. It does require that over 50% of the owners within that designated area sign the petition to move forward. Policy can establish that you require even more, but the minimum within the statute is 50%. Ultimately, the owners and the association are to come forward with a plan, a third-party plan to address the housing improvement needs that are as part of that public hearing. They determine the needed improvements. They go forward and consider the types of improvements and maintenance that are necessary. The city is the one providing the financing at the end of the day. The ability to establish that housing improvement area requires that the council adopt an ordinance after the initial public hearing. A notice is published and mailed to each owner within that area as part of the hearing process, and the owner may file an objection if they believe that the property is not, at the end of the day, going to benefit from the improvements made with this financing. They need to find that determination within 60 days of the adoption of that ordinance. The fee itself is actually separately established in a subsequent action by a resolution after another public hearing. So this is a fairly lengthy process when a new housing improvement area is established, and there are multiple steps. There is the ability for the local property owners to veto, as long as over 45% of the residents within the designated areas, they can go, while this process is underway, they can veto the ability to include the overall property in a housing improvement area district. As I know that there are some projects that have requested or at least inquired about this type of tool within the community. We did want to recap some best practices that are utilized in other cities throughout Minnesota. Ultimately, even when you're just considering one housing improvement area, there is the likelihood that there will be others in the future. And so best practice is to establish an overarching policy that's going to govern all of these programs for multiple housing improvement areas. Those policies often impose higher petition requirements than the statute requires, just to ensure that this is indeed a type of financing or an improvement that the local homeowners do want. We also have the ability within that ordinance and policy to refine the specific goals of Edina or the local community. Those programs often will establish an application process, so one process that could be universal to all different types of housing improvement areas that are considered throughout the community. That application is very helpful because it can alleviate the requirement to provide evidence and allow staff to underwrite the request before it even comes forward within the public sphere. It can require that you have detailed information about the project scope and have the ability to scrutinize and understand the financing need in much greater detail than otherwise would have been available. Part of best practices as well is to discuss the process for requiring competitive bids for the construction of the improvements, as well as the process and timeline involved in submitting costs again and getting local approval so that you have ultimate transparency about what's going on within these housing improvement areas and the public understands them. And also a best practice is to require an individual development or financing agreement for each one of these projects, a contract, if you will, between that homeowners association or condominium, so that you have the ability to spell out the terms for why this tool is being used, identify disbursement of funds, timelines for the construction of the project, so these projects don't often linger into the future, and also require certain levels of property management oversight, or for the private parties to provide additional security to the city so that its financing can pose minimal risk. Similar to TIF and abatement, there are a variety of ways that you can utilize this mechanism to move a financing forward. You could advance existing funds, and similar to that interfund loan concept I talked about with tax increment, advance those funds upfront, have that loan repaid from the fee revenue as those property taxes are collected in the future from the housing improvement area. You can also issue bonds to provide the funding to construct the improvements. Those bonds are taxable bonds, so they will not be able to benefit from tax exemption because you are assisting directly private owners and they're improving their property. But those bonds can still carry the general obligation of the city, and which could provide an overall lower cost of financing and lower interest due to the credit of Edina, which is at a AAA level. You do want to establish that the HAA, their fees need to provide, in the case of bonds, 105% coverage of the debt service to ensure that there is no need for a levy or other source of funding to provide the necessary statutory coverage that is required for all debt from municipalities in Minnesota. One of the risks to watch out for that you can alleviate through the ordinance is the ability to prepay those fees. So while special assessments can be prepaid by the property owners at any time, They can pay off the remaining balance if their property turns over or if they choose to. You do actually have within your policy setting the ability to deny prepayment or offer it, but that's one of the things to think about at the onset. Prepayment of those revenues could cause some cash flow differentials if you do issue debt. Oftentimes with debt, we fix the of payments into the future. And so if you receive a substantial amount of prepayments over time, it might not create the cash flow that you have available to pay off that debt. There can be some mismatch of funds, but ultimately a prepayment is a benefit to the property owner and so should be considered as part of any program. And you can include an administrative charge within that HIA fee for all of the staff upkeep and oversight that's involved in this process. We've talked a little bit about bonding as another mechanism, but the HRA and the city both have the ability through the statutes to issue bonds for certain types of projects. So, a debt instrument either to supplement certain costs for a qualifying project or even to construct a publicly owned housing development. Interest can be tax exempt to the bond purchaser for certain types of project, certainly if it's publicly owned or public infrastructure, as long as it's not deemed to be specifically a privately used improvement. Those bonds can be secured by what's called a general obligation, essentially the backing of the city's ability to levy a property tax. That is the security that is the impetus for the city's AAA bond rating, understanding that ability to levy a property tax for over a tax base the size of Edina, credit rating agencies deem that to be a fairly likely scenario and a very low risk, and give it the highest credit rating that is available. But that doesn't mean that you have to apply that backing to a bond. You could limit that backing through a specific revenue source, such as if you were to consider a TIF district and wanted full certainty that only those tax increments were going to be used to pay back that bond, and there was zero chance that you would need to step in and appropriate other funds or even levy that property tax. You could do so. That's called a revenue bond. Typically, a revenue bond is going to require a much higher level of underwriting and potentially pay a higher interest cost because it doesn't carry that AAA backing, but it could be still a fairly secure repayment source. These bonds are typically paid from a variety of sources. It could be from the housing revenues from the publicly owned project. It could be from tax increment financing. You could additionally secure them through a mortgage on a particular property or even dedicate other existing funding sources within the community. And one last type of bonding is the ability to issue conduit or pass-through bonds, which I do have some additional slides on, but I think we might skip due to time constraints. But this would be the ability to apply that tax-exempt authority that you do have and provide that to either nonprofits or certain types of qualifying projects. The IRS tax code gives municipalities the ability to issue tax-exempt debt. It doesn't give private parties the ability, even if their project does qualify under the parameters of the tax code. They're not able to issue the debt. And so oftentimes nonprofits or certain types of housing developers with qualifying projects will approach cities, in particular, in some cases counties, to actually issue the bonds as a conduit. They enter into an agreement with you so that all of the repayment is actually assigned to the project, so that you are protected and don't have to pledge any of your resources to the repayment of those obligations. But this is the mechanism that's necessary for them to obtain that tax-exempt financing that can be essential to lower the costs of their projects. When we're talking about public bonds, repayment can be up to 40 years to stretch out that amortization of those bonds to lower the potential level of payments. You can utilize up to 100% financing, especially in the case when there is general obligation backing. It's the underwriting will not necessarily focus on the project in particular. They'll focus more on your ability to levy that tax, as I mentioned. Even if you're planning to pay for it from another source of revenue, that general obligation backing, that's what the underwriter is going to focus on. And so they are oftentimes able to provide up to 100% financing for even speculative housing projects. That is going to be more limited in the case of revenue bonds when we are limiting that repayment source. Oftentimes those will carry some of the same underwriting that you will see in conventional mortgage financing. The need to have equity posted upfront in the project, perhaps even a reserve put in place to cover debt service payments in case there were a shortfall. HRA has the ability to issue several of these bonds or could do it through the city and be a partner. HRA has the ability to issue bonds repaid from properties where it intends to lease those properties. In many cases, we've actually done this in partnership with the city for some facilities, but you could also use it with a private tenants and use their lease revenue to repay the bonds. It's also often used in the cases of tax increment financing. The HRA could obligate its HRA levy as the source of repayment for those bonds. It could also request that the city provide its general obligation backing for certain types of senior or affordable housing projects identified in Chapter 469 of the statutes. So the next couple of slides discuss tax-exempt bonds. I already covered most of this as the conduit type of financing, and I understand that you do have some additional items that you want to address in your discussion this morning. So I'm going to stop right here for any questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss many of these tools, and I'm sure we'll be back before you to discuss implementing some of them in the near time. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was an outstanding presentation, and I'm hoping that we can have your presentation available for all of us to use as a resource as we move forward. Manager Neal, were there some things that you wanted to address from a question standpoint, or other commissioners had expressed interest in exploring a particular aspect of public finance?
From the staff side, there isn't. We did want you to know we are working on the HIA aspect of this. We've been interested in that off and on over the years. The council and the HRA has, so there is some activity going on behind the scenes to bring a more fully fledged policy to you at some point soon.
Okay. Questions from or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Mr. Anhut. How are you?
Morning.
A question quickly on HIA financing. Is that reserved exclusively for common interest communities or ownership options, or is it possible to use that approach on, say, a rental property? The reason I ask, we've had occasions, say when Aon or a nonprofit might acquire an existing naturally occurring affordable housing building, and 8 units, 10, 12, 14, whatever. Renovation costs in those can often mount and may over the course of time. And I'm just wondering, excuse me, I'm just wondering if that HIA tool might be applicable in that situation.
There is the potential that it can be used when there are particularly units that are being rented within an association or common interest community. However, it is not intended to be used specifically for a standalone multifamily project. So in the case where you have just one ownership, there are, I believe the policy thought was there are other tools available in the form of TIF abatement or other mechanism. Tax abatement might actually be something that those projects that otherwise wouldn't qualify for TIF, you could potentially utilize. So there are other options, but I think those specific examples that you mentioned would not likely qualify.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Member Anderson, I'm glad you had the energy to be with us this morning. Thank you for being here. Yeah. Other questions, comments about this public finance, Commissioner Jackson?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Anhut. This was extremely helpful. I really appreciate you going into such detail. This one question I had was about the pooled monies. And so those can be used for a variety of reasons as sort of block money to help other projects, and then you mentioned them as revolving loans. So as you know, we've got the Southdale TIF district is going to be retired pretty quickly. And we've got some money. If we were to loan that out, that's a use of the money, right? But I wrote down a question. So that's one question. And the other one is just, can you kind of list off what the uses of those pooled monies might be? Some examples besides the revolving loans.
Certainly. So TIF pooled funds, again, these are funds that you've collected over time. They can provide a seed money for a revolving loan program. There are quite a few restrictions on that, probably too many to go over in this discussion, but it can be done. That HRA levy would provide much more flexibility, but those funds certainly can be used in that way. Other ways that they can be utilized, you could just use them to pay for rehabilitation to an existing NOAA property, as long as that's going to be an affordable property going forward. That pooling creates the ability to invest in those projects and not need to rely on necessarily improving their value over time. You could just stabilize their value and preserve that affordability by providing upfront financing for them. You could also use that pooling. You could issue the same kind of pay-as-you-go note to whoever's developing that property that says that over time, as you collect, if you do still have an active TIF district, as you collect future revenues, you can assign that to help them obtain a higher level of financing within their own projects, so you don't actually contribute money up front. They can be, as I mentioned, grants. You could even use the pooling in certain circumstances to install infrastructure that serves the development. So maybe if there's a streetscaping or maybe accessibility through a trail or something that serves that affordable housing project, then you could take on that cost instead of passing it through to the developer, as perhaps there's a greater benefit to not just that property, but also the city as a whole for installing those types of infrastructure. So those are some ideas.
Great, thank you so much.
Member Commissioner Pierce.
Thank you. Man, it's really awesome to see experts who know the details of things like this. So thank you for being here. And I don't know if my question fits in the context, and I may not use the right words, but hopefully you can bear with me. So on your slides, you were around slide 25 and you started talking about bonds. One of the challenges for affordable housing continues to be funding, right, to get those projects done. And so I just wondered if is there any kind of a construct where we essentially would be able to create, I'm going to call it kind of a private sector fund. And the construct, the way to think about it would be their retirement funds today. whether they be pensions or private retirement funds, where people have been in higher risk investments and they're looking for something that is lower risk to stash their dollars. And so that typically you would do like a bond, you buy bonds at some point. And so as you talk about publicly offered securities or bonds, is there a construct where we might be able to, I guess, issue bonds to the private sector to then fund affordable housing projects with the intent that our market rate would cover the cost of that, and there would be an appreciation that might be that might supersede anything that a private investor might find a bond in the public market. Does that make sense?
I think I understand the construct, and there are certainly private funds that do that, in order to raise capital for certain types of projects. Our ability to obtain that kind of financing, I think, will be much more limited. But I do want to put some careful thought into this topic. So perhaps this is something that I can follow up with Stephanie. And there are certain mechanisms that might get close to what you're describing, Commissioner. But it's not going to be the same way as you're thinking that maybe a foundation in partnership with a bank would be able to do.
Okay. Yeah, I just in general, it's trying to find a way to make things that aren't always as popular with everyone, but you're trying to find a way to get people to buy into doing something that's good for the entire community. And if we could find a way to shift some of that burden to the private sector with some kind of a payback, I just think that might be interesting. And so that's the basis for my question. Just wondering if there's something like a construct like that might work. So thank you.
The Affordable Housing Trust would probably be the closest aspect. You have the potential within that trust to attract external investment. They'd have to have some pretty robust discussions about it, but I think it could get close.
Okay. Thank you. You've made my day, man. It looks like I made you think about something differently. Thank you.
Others? Okay. I think Manager Neal, I appreciate the fact that you folks are looking internally, I suppose, along with Nick, at this housing improvement areas policy and potential ordinance. It's something that, as Nick mentioned, we've looked at over the years. We've had some of our older condominium associations come to us from time to time that need a new roof or need a new window, and the bank financing is too difficult, too expensive, and they're always wondering about whether the city can do that, and we've been unable to assist in that manner. And of course, we have an interest, I think, a distinct interest in making sure that property in our community is kept up. And we do that on the private side with residential houses, and people can get assistance if they need it. But on those common interest communities, it's been a different situation.
Sometimes the issue is the politics of the project itself within the HOA, and there's not a consensus on the HOA board, and they want the city to step in and be the bad guy, so to speak, to make the roof get done if there's not enough support internal to get it done. So there's lots of issues that go along with it, even when we do get a request to intervene, so to speak.
Yeah, no doubt. Other thoughts on this? So Nick, can you make that presentation available to the staff, and then they can disseminate it to all of us, so we've got it in our hip pocket for reference? And then
Absolutely.
Commissioner Pierce can study it some more and come up with some other creative ideas that stump the public.
I look forward to the challenge. I really do appreciate the questions.
All right. Very good. So one of the other topics we had on the agenda this morning was to discuss a little bit 5146 Eden Avenue. We've got about a half an hour of time left, and I'm wondering if folks want to address this today based on the sketch plan conversation we had the other evening, or whether we want to try to set up a specific time for the HRA to have more time to discuss this issue. It does seem to me like it's a topic that would be best handled in a single block of time, and I'm not sure half an hour is enough time to talk it through.
I'd say yes and.
Yes,
Oh, okay.
agree.
All right. Why things are still relatively fresh in our minds?
Yes, I'm looking forward to the update here, but also I think, and it really reflects, Mr. Chair, your comments that I watched about 3 times yesterday to kind of really understand this a little bit better. I think that the sooner that we get together in a work session as early as next week, I mean, we're not really, if I recall, our exclusive right to negotiate the applicant or developer's exclusive right to negotiate with us ends right at the end of May, and our schedule may or may not allow for a good, solid working session to really explore thoroughly what the feelings of the HRA and council might be on it. So I would just make that request going into the update that we move as quickly as possible to schedule that time. I think there's a great deal to discuss.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So we could sure spend some time now. It sounds like folks would prefer that we at least begin the conversation on the HRA at the HRA level. One thing I talked to Manager Neal about was I was wishing I had in front of me the other night at the council meeting I'll call it essentially an agreement that Mr. Neuendorf or a pledge that he put in place for us that said, okay, if we go on to talking about iteration 9, here's the kind of the lay of the land. Here are the factors that you guys all agree to. Us going back into discussions with this development team from United and Frauenschuh. And I don't know if you happen to have that this morning or not, Mr. Neuendorf, if you happen to have that available. I think that might help us frame up the discussion a little bit.
Sure.
What we said we would do in order to make your task and everybody else's task a little bit more defined and probably a little bit more efficient and easier as well.
Yes, I certainly have that up, and I can do a very brief update. But so far it sounds like everyone's on the same path. So back in January, the HRA did enter into a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, with Frauenschuh and United Properties, and that MOU requested that they work on a new concept that includes the ownership housing, the senior co-op in this case, public green space, a commercial building on the southern edge, and then room and space for a pedestrian bridge to cross the tracks. And it was those 4 elements that we had discussed as an HRA back in the fall of 2020, back in starting in October, November, and December. So that's exactly what we've been working on the last several months. With that being said, the agreement is strictly an agreement to talk and explore and see if this concept that sounded good on paper also makes sense in from a construction standpoint. So there's no obligation for the HRA to commit to these uses. There's also no obligation for the developers to commit to these uses at this time. This is strictly another exploratory phase. Member Anderson is exactly correct. This agreement extends through the end of May. That's the period where we've agreed that we will exclusively work with Frauenschuh and United Properties to see if there is a way to mix these four items together in a way that achieves our goals, that delivers some financial resources to the HRA in a potential land sale, but I think even more importantly, or equally importantly, creates a place that we're excited about. So in the last 2 weeks, as you know, this concept went to the Planning Commission, went to the City Council for the sketch plan review to get some of that feedback. And I think it's safe to say that neither of those entities received this concept very well. Most comments really focused on what it was lacking as opposed to what it was delivering. So I did speak with the developers yesterday. They received the message very loudly and very clearly that what was in this latest concept just isn't what's going to excite us. So they are willing to start over, to make changes, explore ways to put other uses. There was a lot of discussion about creating a destination or an activity or some kind of community programming on the space. So they're happy to explore that as well. But I think it's very vital, absolutely essential for this group to have a separate meeting. And so that's what I wanted to touch on today was just the importance of sitting down in a discussion in the next couple weeks, so that this group can really better identify what are our goals. When we say activity or destination, we really should clarify what we mean by that. Otherwise, I fear changes to this concept would just be going in circles again. But the developer is willing to step back and let us figure out what we want. Come back with another proposal in the future. But I agree with the comments that you made, Mr. Mayor, that we need more than 20 minutes. I think this is a 45 to 60-minute conversation, if not longer, to really discern what the HRA wants to do with this asset.
I think it's at least an hour and a half long conversation, just based on experience. Commissioner Pierce.
Thank you. So I agree with everything that was just said. I just wanted to frame where I was coming from in the meeting. I felt like I was the only one that might have been in the middle, slanting into the middle. And so anytime you have one person that might be in the middle who probably still isn't a yes vote, and then everyone else is on the other side, kind of the far side, it's just pointless to keep talking about it, especially in front of the developer. And so what I thought the challenge is that it felt like we weren't on the same page with what we wanted, just like Mr. Neuendorf said. And the comprehensive plan and the small area plans are supposed to give a developer some sense of that. But I didn't feel that way. And it's almost as if I asked each of us to draw a house on a sheet of paper and I'm a developer, I would get 12 different houses. But if what I really wanted was the most creative 2-story house, they can be creative. But if I come back and I say, all right, guys, draw the best 2-story house, but be as creative as you want to, then I'm going to get 10 options that now I can actually go choose between and then go to the next level of refinement. And I just felt like for this, it was clear to me that I didn't feel like we had really good sense of what it actually means. And I could use Commissioner Jackson's example of the bridge. The idea of what she had in her mind for that bridge was awesome. But they actually met the criteria for what they presented to us. And so if we want something a bridge that's going to provide multiple uses, we need to be clear about that and still let them be creative in how they achieve that.
Yeah,
So I
thank
think
you.
that's what we need to spend time on.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Jackson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple of things, but one is I had a long conversation with Mr. Neuendorf yesterday about the history of this. And I think it would be really useful for the public to hear the constraints. Commissioner Pierce just mentioned the comprehensive plan, and I was looking at the Grandview Small Area Plan, and this site had envisioned a park and ride, and that's an impossibility now. So the entire picture that's in there existed at the time this plan was put together, and it's not an option now. So there are some very serious constraints that are part of this project that we need to memorialize for the public and specifically for the Planning Commission. And he also went into gory detail on the engineering challenges with that bridge. And that's why I'm very happy to fund the study for doing a pedestrian bridge. It would be super exciting to do something else, but just as I said, Mr. Neuendorf went into gory details about all the constraints in that little corner of land, and a pedestrian bridge is really the best option. But I think we need to tell the public that. So that's kind of, I'd like to start our next discussion with a history of the constraints on this piece of project, because I think that would really inform our deliberations. And then I think eventually I love the term that we talked about, what is the outcome that we want? And is it financial? Is it an exciting use? And I think that's a policy question that I want to end up at. So start with the history, have a discussion of the issues, and then what is the outcome? So that's how my mind is working on this issue. So thank you.
Thank you. Others, Commissioner Staunton?
So I think I will continue to be the voice of history, or however we want to put it. It was just over 9 years ago this month, that the council adopted the Grandview framework. And in those 9 years, we haven't been able to make anything happen. And so there are a lot of things that haven't been able to occur. And I think the way Commissioner Jackson describes it is accurate. Some of those things are just things that we've realized we can't do, that we're in the dream, so to speak, of the framework, but just are either fiscally not feasible or physically not feasible. But my goal going forward is to try to keep the spirit of the framework persistent and alive as we go forward. And that's why I've focused on this destination business, because I think that's still a piece of that whole framework that we can work toward. And so that'll be my focus as we go forward, is how do we keep the best of the spirit of that, even if the mechanics of it can't work.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Commissioner Anderson, any further thoughts as we think about setting up a meeting to have a in-depth discussion?
No, I think the time that we spend really comprehensively looking at it will be, I think, far better use of time.
All right. I'm thinking that as to Commissioner Jackson's comment, Commissioner Staunton and I discussed this yesterday, and it was 2004, I think, when when the property was first appraised. I don't remember what the year it was exactly. We built a new public works building, but it's been a long journey here. Fortunately, the property has continued to go up in value as we wrestle with what to do with it. It was frustrating for me the other night because I felt like we got part of what we were looking for, and what I heard was, I think, a pretty uniform affection for the senior cooperative housing, because it does meet a distinct need in our community in terms of product affordability. it helps limit traffic in the area, which is one of the concerns that we've historically had. And so when we talk about the MOU and the 4 elements of the MOU, I feel like we're partway there. For me, the upper half, I feel like is kind of figured out. It's that lower half of the property. It doesn't work yet. And it's the green space and it's the use at Eden and Arcadia. We don't have right yet. And I think Commissioner Staunton is making a very excellent point when he talks about, let's go back to the framework. We can't do half public, half private. We can't capture that, but there is a spirit there that we want to try to capture that was distinctly absent from what we saw the other night. And so I think this conversation we have to be very productive. And I think for the newest members of the council and the HRA, it would be good to have a historical synopsis, short Cliff Notes history of all the different things we've tried to do on that property and where we haven't found anything yet that we think works, that retains that spirit of the framework. So I'm eager for this conversation, but I think we should allow up to a couple hours worth of time because it will be an in-depth conversation and I think highly, highly productive and get us to the point where we can actually finally figure out what we want to do with I'll call it the bottom half of that property.
Thank you,
So,
Mr. Chair.
Manager
That's
Neal
great.
and Mr. Neuendorf, go ahead. Commissioner Jackson, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say thank you, Mr. Chair, for articulating that so clearly. That's really, really helpful.
All right. Manager Neal, when can we get together? Do we want to do this on a special meeting basis or another work session, or how do you want to do it?
I think we do want to do it as a special meeting, given the time frame. We can also, of course, seek some assurance or some affirmation from the developer to give us a little bit more time. But we'll try to figure that the logistics of that out, and I would say look for some calls from probably Jen Garsky or Liz Olson to try to put this together in terms of what our respective timeframes are and availabilities.
This is really the kind of project where you'd like to have paper in front of you with big site plans, and you can push stuff around a conference table, and we all are together. I don't know if that's possible or not. How many have been? Member Anderson, you probably aren't even vaccinated yet. You were on the verge of getting vaccinated, I think, when you had.
Yes, thank you. I was, and I tested positive 2 days before the vaccination. I was chasing this Johnson & Johnson for way too long, and it was really kind of, in looking back, I'd say, yeah, bad idea. But be that as it may, I can't get vaccinated for 90 days, but my antibodies, I'm not transmittable either. So there's that, or at least that's what the docs say.
We can assess that possibility given what our other parameters are for public meetings. But
I was thinking of one possibility is if it's safe to get back together personally, we could, like even Public Works where we have a lot of space and mask and distance we can maintain. I don't know. It's just a possibility. Maybe we can get this done just fine in the virtual world. But
you're kind of talking about what the Michaels would refer to as a charrette.
Yeah, design charrette. And I don't know how other people feel about getting together. Some people are comfortable, some aren't. And I think it's then in that circumstance, you got to be deferential to the people that aren't. And that includes staff. So
I hate to say this. I didn't understand that reference, the Michaels and the charrette.
So Mike Fisher and Michael Schroeder, who I served for years on the planning commission with, are both in the design world. And this notion of a charrette is an old French word for gathering people to get ideas to figure out how to come up with a group direction on a design. And it's an interesting notion that is it often sounds great, but hard to carry off in a really good way. But
gotcha. I thought it was an R&B group.
It's a great
Thank
name
you.
for an R&B group. Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't heard their records lately. The Design Charette.
They would be from New Orleans, right?
Yeah, good. Commissioner Jackson, did you have a comment?
Oh, I just want to, my training is still fresh in my head on the Open Meetings Act. And it would be great if we could broadcast from the Public Works building, but and I know Chair or Executive Director Neal would think about this, but we got to include the public in this discussion.
Well, not have them participate, but have them observe is what you're thinking.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Have it be a public meeting, not a public hearing.
Correct.
All right. Okay.
We'll do
Well,
some
I mean, I guess
schedule-
staff, we'll let you manage that and see what you can come up with. Okay.
So I think I understand that would be if we should assess the possibility of an in-person meeting, but at a minimum, I think we want to get together virtually at a minimum and have a couple hours to do that. And that's a tricky task to find a couple hours that works for everyone. So we'll get on that right away. And also Mr. Neuendorf can check in with the developer to let them know that we're working on this and what our time frame might be.
I would assume it means early evening or at the end of the workday, some period of time after 5 or 6.
We'll get to work on that.
Okay. All right. Does any other commissioners have comments they want to make, or executive director, any further comments?
None from me.
All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved.
Commissioner Anderson moves, Commissioner Jackson seconds. Any further discussion? Roll call, please, Ms. Olson, with respect to adjournment.
Commissioner Staunton,
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
Commissioner Anderson,
Aye.
Chair Hovland.
Aye. We stand adjourned. Oh, Member Staunton. Oh, I've got one other thing too I wanted to comment on. So yeah, Member Staunton, Commissioner Staunton.
No, I was just waving goodbye.
Oh, well, here's some good news for the moment. We got our lost bill, our local option sales tax bill is now in the Senate omnibus bill.
Oh,
Not the House
yay.
bill.
Yeah.
Now we're
Wow.
there's still all kinds of ways things can go south on you at the legislature, but we just got notification here
Great.
from our lobbyists that we are in the Senate bill, which is
Really
fantastic.
important.
Having worked with a community that took 10 years to finally land the big fish, to do it in the first try would be extraordinary.
Okay, so there's the departing news today.
Yes. Thanks for the good
Thanks, everybody.
news.
You.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.